Hello there. Welcome to today's First Chesapeake chat session. I am Ryan Fulham, along with Abby Henshaw, both First Chesapeake alumni and alumni ambassadors sponsored by Booz Allen Hamilton. I am here to introduce the First Chesapeake chats. I would like to thank this session sponsor, Newport News Shipbuilding, for making this chat possible. Just some housekeeping. We will let the speakers present and then open up the discussion questions later on if there is time. But feel free to put questions in the comments throughout the chat, and we will try to get to them all. Our speaker for this session is Laura Berman, PhD candidate.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Doing all right.
So would you like to give us just a little introduction of yourself and what you do?
Sure. I am a PhD candidate at the National University of Singapore. So I live in the opposite side of the world. So it's 6 p.m. for you guys, it's 6 a.m. for me over here. Singapore it's a little island nation between Malaysia and Indonesia, like in that island archipelago. So I study birds, and the lab that I work in does a lot of work on evolution and conservation and ecology and all of these things. So the kinds of things that I do, I plan field expeditions into the jungle. So go to different countries, different islands around the region. We catch birds and collect blood samples and use those blood samples to sequence the genomes of different species to look at the evolutionary relationship between birds on different islands and all of those things. I also do some work in bioacoustics. So I have these autonomous recording devices that get deployed out in the jungle, and they record continuous soundscapes of all of the sounds that are happening out there. And then I take those recordings and I do some machine learning work. I build classifiers that can automatically recognize the sound of different species of birds. And then those can go through all of those recordings and pick out every time a particular species sings. And you can use that to detect rare species in different places. You can use that to detect activity patterns and breeding seasons and all of these things. So those are some of the things that I'm working on right now. And I've worked in lots of other places as well. So right now I'm living in Singapore, but I've also lived and worked in Panama studying planktonic ecosystems and the coral reef type things. I've worked out in California and Nevada in the desert studying sage grouse. So yeah, I've done some different stuff.
Yeah, that's all so interesting. Do you mind talking a little bit about how you got to this point where you're in Singapore, across the world studying these things?
So I guess in college, I knew that I was interested in conservation and wildlife. And I knew that I wanted to do something that was intellectually challenging, but also let me run around in the woods and play with animals. So I did a lot of exploring. I did lots of summer internships. And then after I graduated, I worked lots of different jobs kind of in my field to explore that a little bit. So.
Yeah, do you want to expand more on like those jobs that you worked when you're sort of between college and going to get your PhD?
Yeah, well, the job I did in Panama, I was an intern at the Smithsonian Conservation Research Institute. And that was on a little island on the Atlantic side of Panama. And what we were doing there was looking at dead zones. Are you guys familiar with dead zones?
I think so. They're like where the fish tend to not
Yeah,
exactly
right.
live.
Right. So that's something something we have in the Chesapeake Bay as well. So when you get lots of pollution and different chemicals and things going into the water, it can cause these algal blooms, and algal blooms consume all of the oxygen. And then once the oxygen gets below a certain point, everything dies. All the fish die, and you get these dead zones in the water. And the place that I was working in Panama had a very similar thing because that particular chain of islands was getting a lot more tourism, and they didn't have a good trash system. So a lot of the trash was just getting dumped into the ocean. So there were these periodic anoxic events that would happen, and you would just in particular areas, all the coral would be dead, all the fish would be dead. And what we were actually looking at was how the ecosystem recovered from that. So we would go to those places and survey the planktonic community, all the tiny little organisms living in the water. We'd look at the benthic community, which is all the organisms living down in the sediment on the ocean floor, and look at the way that those communities recovered after the oxygen came back into the water to kind of see what that process is, understand it better, to maybe help, encourage those things to recover better in the future and all those things. So, yeah, that was that project.
Yeah, so you mentioned how in your current work you sort of are using machine learning in looking at the audio of birds. How does sort of the study of technology and biology combine? Do you think like you need to know technology to study biology? Like how do those fields intersect?
So I think they're coming together more and more because there's all of these really cool technologies that are coming up that make it so much easier to analyze data, so much easier to look at really big data sets that you wouldn't be able to do in old-fashioned, like the traditional manual ways. For example, the bioacoustic stuff that I'm doing. So lots of people have done bioacoustic studies in the past where, so with birds in particular, so birds have a lot of sexual selection. So the males signal to the females in a particular way, and those signals help define species boundaries. So different birds have very distinct songs that the males use to attract the females, and that's how the species recognize each other. So you can have two birds that look very similar, but if they sing different songs, they're different species because the females will only be attracted to the males who sing the particular song that they recognize. So you can find these cryptic species by studying the different songs of birds in different places. So lots of people have done these kinds of studies where they look at the calls in different places. They can only look at so many sounds at a time. Because you only have so much time to listen to so many different things. But with machine learning, with these new technologies that you can use, you can automatically scan through thousands of hours of data and work with such big data sets and get really cool new results that you wouldn't have been able to do without that technology.
Yeah. So we have a question from the chat about your research specifically. They're asking if you use standard audio microphones for data acquisition, or what type of microphones you use.
So the microphones that I use, is anyone familiar with a Raspberry Pi?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if people do lots of like, I don't know, modding with their own stuff, maybe you've used it before. So they're like a tiny computer that's just essentially one microchip, and you can add all kinds of different stuff on it. So I use something called an audio moth, which is similar to a Raspberry Pi, but it's designed for recording sound specifically. So it's essentially one little circuit board that has a microphone on it and an SD card. And I've modified those to have battery power that lasts for like 2 months. And I put them in these, built these waterproof enclosures. So I go out into the jungle and I deploy those, and they record for 2 months, and then I go and I replace the batteries and I take out the data and they continue recording. So that's been kind of cool. That's a little bit of an engineering side to things, putting those together.
Yeah, and on the engineering side, have you sort of had to learn those engineering skills along the way? Because your background seems is more in biology. So how's that learning process been?
Oh yeah, definitely. A lot of this is kind of figuring it out as you go along. So yeah, my background's in biology, and I had to, you know, learn how to solder and all kinds of things that I hadn't necessarily done before. But yeah, I think that's part of the fun of science, is going out and finding some new thing that you haven't done before and just figuring out how it works.
Yeah.
So we have another question in the chat about these microphones, and they're asking about the frequency range that you're recording.
Oh, okay. So I wonder who's asking that. That is actually quite relevant. So the different frequencies depend on what you're looking for. So I mostly study birds. So I record up to 8 kilohertz. But there's a lot of really cool animals that are around here that call at much higher frequencies. So if you want to record bats, you've got to record up like several hundred kilohertz. And we've got some really strange species of frogs that live in this region that also call at those super high frequencies, kind of like bats.
That's really cool. Someone seems to be very interested in the specifics of your research, which is awesome. So you seem to have traveled a lot. You said you've worked in Panama. You're now in Singapore. Did you always know you wanted to travel, or did you just sort of follow the opportunities that you got?
I think I did always want to travel. That's part of what I think is very interesting about my job, and part of the reason I like it, that I get to go to these really cool and interesting places. You know, I get to, you know, bash around the rainforest and call it work. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that seems it would be really fun. Do you have any fun stories from your time in all over the world that you want to share?
Oh my gosh, I've done lots of things. I think one of my favorite things about living in Panama is that I was staying at a field station that was right on the water, in a coral reef. So after work, I could jump in a kayak and kayak out over the reef and watch the sunset with my feet like dangling into the water with all the fish swimming around, and, you know, just stick your face in and look at the sponges, look at the corals. So yeah, there's some beautiful places out in the world.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. Sort of switching topics here. So you work in biology now. Would you say, if there are students who sort of want to be doing what you're doing, would you recommend they major in biology? Would you recommend they sort of like also study some engineering in college? What would you sort of recommend for them to do in college?
So other people who are doing what I'm doing generally majored in biology or in environmental science. But speaking honestly, I think that people can shift around and explore more than you think. You know, when you start out working on one thing, that's not the thing you're going to be trapped doing for the rest of your life. You know, you can major in one thing and then get a job doing something slightly different. And then a year later, you know, maybe you find a job doing something else. And you don't necessarily end up pigeonholed in one thing. So I think it's important to do what you really enjoy and see where that leads you. But yeah, for what I'm doing, biology is the major that you'd be looking at.
Yeah, so if you were sort of continuing on this like advice for undergrads, if you were to go and talk to your sort of college self or maybe deciding to go to college self, what advice would you give to her that you think may be helpful for others?
So I think a really valuable experience for me in college was internships. So every summer I did an internship in a different place. So that's, you know, 3 months working a job doing something. So I spent 3 months at the Smithsonian Research Center that's in Virginia, looking at you know the Frozen Zoo. Have you heard of the Frozen Zoo?
I have not heard of the Frozen Zoo, but it sounds very interesting.
So there are lots of endangered species that are in zoos, but a zoo can't maintain a large breeding population of each species it has. They usually have just 1 or 2 individuals. So if you want to breed your endangered species, you have to get some way to connect the zebra in the zoo in China with the zebra in the zoo in San Diego. So a lot of what goes on is artificial insemination. So you collect sperm samples from the male at one zoo animal, and you have to freeze that and be able to transport it over somewhere else. And using the same technology, there are a lot of breeding programs that are going on with species that have so few individuals that if one of them dies, you know, your population crashes. So they'll actually save the sperm of as many males as they can and keep it frozen for long periods of time so that even if an individual dies, you don't lose that part of the population. You don't lose that part of the genetics. So the internship I was doing there was essentially figuring out how to make this work for different species, because each different species, the cells are a little bit different. And you've got to use slightly different methods to make it work well. I feel like I went off on a little bit of a tangent. We were talking about
advice for your college self, and you're talking about internships.
Yeah, that an internship is like a little window into a possible job you can have in the future. So you spend 3 months doing something, and then the next summer spend 3 months doing something else. And it's an opportunity to get some really cool experiences and an opportunity to kind of explore and see what you really enjoy. If you're going to college for engineering and then you do 3 months of an internship at what you thought was your dream job and you just hate it, then maybe you go and you pursue something else, you know?
Yeah, that's great advice. We have another question from the chat that's more specific about your research, and they're asking about your machine learning engine, or do you just want to talk more about the machine learning aspect in general?
Oh, okay. So machine learning isn't as complicated as it sounds. It's a little bit of a black box. You put information in, and then the computer does its thing, and something pops out, and you're like, maybe the quality is good, maybe the quality is bad. A lot of it is a bit repetitive, actually, because you're training the computer. So when we're working with acoustics, essentially the computer pulls out lots of sounds, and you say either that is the sound that I need or that's not the sound that I need. And you tell it thousands and thousands of times until the computer gets a kind of mental image of what it is that you're looking for. And then once you've essentially taught the computer how to recognize a particular thing, then it can run through, hours and hours of data and go through much more quickly. But yeah, it sounds fancy, and I guess it is fancy, but the actual manual labor going into it isn't too complicated.
Yeah, so you're a PhD candidate. And that, I know, as a college student myself, is sort of a big mystical thing on the horizon of potentially getting a PhD. So do you want to talk a bit more about what led to that decision and how one sort of decides to pursue one?
So I knew I wanted to do research because in my mind, research is like, you're discovering new things that nobody's ever known before, and it's very exploratory, and I think that's cool. And I think for someone who wants to do research, doing a PhD seems logical because you're doing the same thing you would be doing if you just went out and got your normal job, except at the end of 4 years or however long it takes, you have a degree. So essentially what I'm doing now is my research, but after 4 years, I'm in my 3rd year now, so pretty soon. I essentially pull together the research I've done, I present it as a thesis, and they say, yes, you've done good research, or no, you've not done good research. And then, that's the PhD. So I think of it as an opportunity to get education out of something that I enjoy anyway. But, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Now, not to sort of be too scary, but sort of what would life look like after a PhD? Do you think you'll continue with this research project? Will you find some new research to do? How does that sort of play out?
Okay. So I think I will continue doing research, but I'm sure it will be in other kinds of projects because you finish one project, and then once you've kind of answered that question, then you move on to another thing, and that's kind of the nature of these things. I think I'll continue working in generally the same area, but yeah.
Do you think you'll stay in Singapore or travel somewhere new? Like, would you want to come back to the US? Like, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, there's. I probably wouldn't stay in Singapore. I'd find another university, do a postdoc or something there. But yeah, there's lots of great universities in the US as well, and lots of cool research going on there.
So we've talked a bit about your PhD process. What sort of inspired the decision to apply abroad for that, or how did that sort of go?
So that's a good point. That I'm pretty far away, and I guess this is a kind of weird answer. So I'm interested in tropical ecology. I'm interested in, all of the really cool biodiversity that are in the tropics. And there's lots of universities that do tropical research. But, you'll be at a university somewhere in the United States, and then you travel down to South America or something. And I like the idea of being in a university that's based in the tropics rather than just having special tiny field trips to go down to the tropics. It feels less imperialistic. I don't know. um, but yeah, that rather than just having a brief field trip to come down and see the habitat that I'm studying, I live in the tropical region that I'm studying, and I think that makes a difference.
Yeah, so that sounds amazing. I would have to ask, as someone who's not great with foreign language, how does foreign language sort of play a role in where you want to study? Do you have any foreign language skills? Are those needed, do you think?
It definitely helps because in lots of very rural areas, people don't speak English. I actually, in college, I expected to be working in South America rather than in Southeast Asia. So I double majored in biology and Spanish. So my Spanish is quite fluent, but that's not necessarily useful here. So when I've worked, I lived in Ecuador for a little while, I lived in Panama for a little while, and the Spanish was definitely very useful there because, I mean, it allows you to interact with the community and outreach to the community and all of those things. Lately, I've been learning Bahasa Indonesia, the Indonesian language, because that's most useful for my fieldwork here. Because, I mean, so we've got this big archipelago, and there's Bahasa Indonesia and Bahasa Melayu spoken in Indonesia and Malaysia, which are quite similar. But I mean, you can get by without it, but I think it's really valuable to be able to speak the language. Yeah.
So I think we're running out of time. So do you have any sort of like last words of advice or just anything you sort of want to end up with just for any students or anyone who may be watching?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's really valuable to have a career that you enjoy and that you're passionate about. And that's if you have to choose between a career that pays really well and a career that you find interesting and enjoyable, I would definitely suggest choosing the second, because then you'll enjoy every minute of your work rather than kind of, I don't know, waiting around for a vacation to do the things that you love. So
yeah, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for talking to us at 6 in the morning where you are. That's crazy.
Yeah, that'll come up in about half an hour.
Oh, great. Thank you to everyone watching. We have a video. Thank you to our sponsor, Newport News Shipbuilding. We have a short video, and we do have another chat after this, so stick around.